The Bluebird Cafe hummed with life under the warm California sun, a beacon for the city's well-heeled. Tucked along a quiet street lined with palm trees, it offered the perfect blend of charm and sophistication. Nearby, a decorative fountain trickled gently, adding to the serene ambience. Inside, waiters in crisp, white aprons moved like clockwork, balancing trays of gourmet dishes and steaming cups of espresso. The scent of freshly baked sourdough and blooming jasmine filled the air, casting a spell over the patrons, most of whom were absorbed in their conversations or their phones. For one man, however, this idyllic setting might as well have been wallpaper. Jonathan Wells sat at the cafe's centerpiece table, his mere presence commanding attention. At 68, he was a household name in corporate America. A billionaire who had built his empire brick by brick, starting with tech startups in the 1980s and expanding into industries far beyond Silicon Valley. Few people knew that Jonathan's success wasn't just built on bold investments but also on his ability to observe, adapt, and transform. In his earlier days, he had once gone undercover as a CEO in his own company to see how it truly operated from the ground up. That experience had shaped his perspective, but now, as he glanced at the menu with slow, deliberate movements, he seemed far removed from that bold visionary. Across from him sat Rebecca, his much younger second wife. Her beauty was striking, almost cinematic, with wavy blonde hair and skin glowing from what had to be a meticulous skincare routine. She wore a designer sundress, her wrist adorned with a delicate gold bracelet that caught the sunlight as she absent-mindedly toyed with it. Everything about her suggested someone well-versed in the art of appearances. Still, something was off. Rebecca smiled, flashing perfect teeth, but her eyes wandered, darting toward her phone as it vibrated on the table. Her polished exterior hid an undercurrent of unease, a tension so subtle that even Jonathan didn't notice, or perhaps chose not to. When his gaze drifted to the fountain outside, Rebecca's fingers brushed against the edge of her designer handbag, her movements calculated and deliberate. Not far from their table, a boy loitered near the cafe's iron fence. His clothes hung loosely on his thin frame, a faded hoodie, worn sneakers, and his presence was barely noticed by the patrons around him. His name was Tyler, and he was a fixture on these streets, an invisible thread in the fabric of the neighborhood. Hunger clawed at him, his stomach growling as he eyed the dishes that passed by. He watched Jonathan and Rebecca carefully, his sharp eyes catching something others would have missed. Jonathan shifted in his seat, lifting his water glass to his lips. Rebecca's hand moved subtly, her fingers brushing something small and metallic in her bag. Tyler's breath caught as he saw her unscrew a tiny vial and tilt it ever so slightly over the steaming bowl of soup in front of Jonathan. The clear liquid disappeared almost instantly, its presence betrayed only by the faintest ripple. Rebecca stirred the soup with casual grace, her expression calm and unbothered. Tyler's heart raced. Had he really just seen what he thought he did? Could someone who looked so perfect, so polished, really be doing something so sinister? His instincts screamed at him to look away, to walk off and pretend it was none of his business. Yet as Jonathan absent-mindedly lifted the spoon toward his lips, Tyler felt a surge of panic. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his legs trembling as he neared the table. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Heads turned, conversations froze, and the clink of silverware on plates suddenly ceased. Jonathan froze mid-motion, the spoon hovering inches from his mouth. Rebecca's head snapped toward Tyler, her face hardening like stone, her voice sharp and cutting as she demanded, "What did you just say?" The once serene atmosphere of the Bluebird Cafe shattered, leaving a palpable tension in the air. It was as if Jonathan's past as an undercover CEO, the man who had once sought out the truth in the shadows of his empire, had suddenly resurfaced, but in a way he never expected. The stage was set for revelations, betrayal, and a moment that would leave everyone, especially Jonathan, questioning what they thought they knew. You're listening to this story from Soul Deep Stories. If it moves you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, betrayal, and redemption. Rebecca's jet black hair framed a face so polished it could have been carved from marble, her bright red lipstick a perfect stroke of artistry. She exuded elegance from every pore, the kind that demanded attention and admiration. Yet, for all her outward perfection, her smile faltered, a mere facade that never quite touched her eyes. Her fingers moved absently, twisting the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a habit that betrayed her composure. Across from her, Jonathan's presence should have been her focal point, but her gaze kept drifting, drawn magnetically to the glowing screen of her phone resting on the table. Nearby, just beyond the cafe's wrought iron patio fence, a boy lingered in the shadows. His small frame was swallowed by an oversized hoodie, its fabric worn and frayed at the edges. Tyler moved with the quiet grace of someone accustomed to being invisible, his dark eyes scanning the scene with precision. Plates laden with gourmet food and the occasional bulge of a patron's wallet caught his attention. But Tyler wasn't just looking for an opportunity to survive another day, he was watching, his instincts sharper than most. The streets had taught him well. Rebecca's diamond bracelet glinted as she leaned forward slightly, her painted nails tapping idly on the table. Jonathan, ever the observant businessman, noticed. He adjusted his watch, the motion deliberate. "You're distracted again," he said, his voice calm but edged with the authority of a man who expected answers. Rebecca's head tilted, her lips curving into a smile that was both sweet and hollow. "I'm right here," she replied softly, her words like velvet, reaching across the table to rest her hand on his. "You know how much I enjoy these lunches." Jonathan didn't respond immediately. His sharp eyes studied her, the years of corporate strategy ingrained in him making it impossible to miss the cracks in her polished demeanor. Meanwhile, Tyler's stomach growled audibly, the sound a painful reminder of the emptiness that had become his constant companion. He edged closer to the fence, his movements as silent as the shadows that hid him. He could almost taste the rich scent of the soup steaming on Jonathan's table. It was the kind of food he hadn't had in months, perhaps years. Hunger sharpened his senses, but it wasn't what stopped him in his tracks. Rebecca's hand slipped into her designer handbag with a subtle, almost imperceptible motion. Tyler's sharp eyes caught it immediately. His breath hitched as he saw her fingers curl around something small and glinting, a vial. Her actions were seamless, like an actress performing a well-rehearsed role. She twisted the cap open with a flick of her wrist and tilted the vial ever so slightly. A few drops of clear liquid fell into Jonathan's bowl of soup, disappearing into the golden broth like a whisper into the wind. Tyler froze, his thin frame pressed against the cold iron of the fence. Could this really be happening? Was he just imagining it, or had he really just witnessed something that shouldn't have been? His mind raced as he replayed the moment over and over. There was no mistaking it, Rebecca had done something. Something wrong. Rebecca stirred the soup delicately, her spoon moving in slow, graceful circles as though nothing had happened. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping just low enough for Jonathan to hear. "After all I've done to make this perfect, don't ruin it now," she said, her tone laced with something Tyler couldn't place, a mix of bitterness and finality. Tyler's fists clenched as he crouched lower behind the railing, his pulse pounding in his ears. The air around him felt heavy, the weight of a choice pressing down on his thin shoulders. He didn't know these people and they certainly didn't know him. Why should he care? Why risk everything for a man like Jonathan Wells, whose wealth and power likely meant he'd never so much as glance at someone like Tyler? But something inside him wouldn't let him walk away. His gaze locked onto Jonathan, who now lifted his spoon, steam curling into the cool afternoon air. Tyler's heart felt like it might burst as he realized he was running out of time. With a surge of determination, he pushed himself up from the fence, his legs trembling beneath him. He marched forward, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses fading as adrenaline took over. "Don't eat that." His voice rang out, cracking but loud enough to stop Jonathan in his tracks. Heads turned, conversations froze, and the entire cafe seemed to collectively hold its breath. Jonathan's spoon hovered inches from his lips, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. Across the table, Rebecca's face hardened, her perfectly painted features twisting into something sharp and unforgiving. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, and Tyler knew there was no turning back. Hadn't seen up close in months, a pristine white bowl of soup, flanked by freshly baked bread and a glass of sparkling water. The meal looked like a dream for someone like Malik, whose empty stomach growled louder with every passing second. But just as he was drawn in by the aroma, something unusual caught his eye. As Bernard adjusted his glasses and glanced at his phone, seemingly lost in a message, Malik noticed Marissa's hand slipping into her designer handbag. Her movements were calm and deliberate, as though she had rehearsed this moment in her mind countless times. Malik's sharp eyes locked onto her as her fingers emerged clutching a small vial. She twisted it open with a flick of her wrist, her motions smooth and practiced as if she'd done this many times before. Then, with a barely perceptible tilt of her hand, a few drops of clear liquid fell silently into the steaming bowl of soup. The liquid blended in instantly, vanishing as if it had never been there, leaving no trace but the lingering sense that something had shifted. Malik's breath hitched. His body froze, rooted to the spot as he watched Marissa stir the soup with the same grace and elegance she had displayed all afternoon. Her expression remained unchanged, serene, poised, and utterly detached. But her next action sent a chill through Malik's thin frame. She leaned forward, her lips parting to deliver words meant only for Bernard, yet loud enough for Malik to catch. "After all the trouble I've gone through, you won't ruin this now," she said, her tone low but laced with an unmistakable edge, one that carried both threat and triumph. Malik blinked, unsure if what he had just seen and heard was real. Could a woman who looked so perfect, so refined, really be capable of what he thought he had just witnessed? His mind raced as doubt and disbelief clashed with the undeniable evidence of his own eyes. Yet no matter how much he wanted to dismiss it, the unsettling feeling deep in his gut wouldn't go away. His chest tightened as his heartbeat thundered in his ears. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He didn't know who Bernard was or why Marissa would do something like this, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore it. His fists clenched as he crouched lower, his instincts screaming at him to stay out of it. Why get involved? What could a boy like him do? No one would listen to him, a kid barely surviving on the streets. But then his eyes landed on Bernard, who was now absent-mindedly reaching for his spoon. The steam curled gently from the soup, inviting and harmless in appearance. Malik's stomach churned, but it wasn't from hunger. He knew what would happen if Bernard took a bite. He didn't need to understand why Marissa had done it. He only knew that he couldn't let it happen. The world around him seemed to slow, the vibrant noise of the cafe fading into a dull hum. The decision pressed down on him, heavy and impossible to ignore. Then, with a surge of adrenaline and a determination he didn't know he had, Malik straightened his back, his legs trembling beneath him. "Don't eat that." The words tore from his throat, loud and clear, breaking through the murmur of conversations and the clinking of glasses. The entire cafe seemed to freeze, heads whipping toward the source of the outburst. Bernard's hand stopped midair, his spoon hovering just inches from his lips. His wide, startled eyes locked on Malik, who now stood by the patio railing, fists clenched and chest heaving. Across the table, Marissa's head snapped toward the boy, her polished expression cracking just slightly, revealing a flicker of something dark and dangerous beneath. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharp and icy, cutting through the stunned silence like a blade. The tension was palpable as the cafe held its collective breath, all eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Malik's heart pounded furiously, but he didn't back down. He had seen enough, and now there was no turning back. Malik crouched lower behind the wrought iron railing, his small frame pressed tightly against it as if the cold metal could somehow shield him from the enormity of what he had just witnessed. His mind churned with doubt, replaying the scene over and over. He wasn't sure if he'd seen what he thought he did, but the cold sharpness in the woman's voice, the calculated way she had whispered those chilling words, sent a shiver coursing down his spine. His fists clenched tightly, his nails digging into his palms until it hurt. No one else had noticed. No one else had been paying attention. The patrons were lost in their own conversations, their laughter and the clink of silverware blending into a serene backdrop. It was just him. The weight of that realization pressed heavily on his thin shoulders, a burden he didn't want but couldn't ignore. His stomach growled, a faint, pitiful sound that snapped him momentarily back to reality. Hunger had been his constant companion for months, but even its gnawing ache couldn't pull his eyes away from the couple. Bernard sat there, tired and distracted, his spoon hovering precariously over the bowl as he checked his phone. His movements were unhurried, oblivious to the danger resting right before him. Across from him, Marissa was the picture of charm and composure once again, her mask firmly back in place. Her bright smile, her hand resting lightly on her chin, all of it so polished, so practiced, it was as though she hadn't just whispered something sinister moments before. Malik's pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of a decision bearing down on him, growing heavier with each passing second. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to melt back into the shadows like he had countless times before. What good would it do to get involved? Who would believe a kid like him, a nobody in a threadbare hoodie, standing on the fringes of a world he didn't belong to? He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight as his eyes darted nervously around the cafe. The other patrons were oblivious, lost in their own bubbles of comfort and conversation. No one noticed the boy hunched by the railing, his body rigid with tension. No one cared. They didn't see the weight of the decision he was grappling with, or the storm raging in his chest. Malik's gaze flicked back to Bernard, who was now dipping his spoon into the steaming bowl, the liquid swirling lazily in the pristine white porcelain. Malik's breath caught, his chest tightening as though the air had been sucked from the world. Time seemed to slow, the moment stretching into eternity. Every fiber of his being told him to stay silent, to let it go, to look the other way. It wasn't his problem. It wasn't his fight. But as the spoon lifted closer to Bernard's lips, Malik felt something shift inside him. A fierce, burning determination that pushed past the fear and the doubt. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't let this happen. With a sudden burst of energy, he rose to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him as he stepped forward. His voice cracked as he shouted, loud enough to cut through the hum of the cafe, "Don't eat that!" The world seemed to stop. Heads turned sharply toward him, conversations halted mid-sentence, and the rhythmic clinking of glasses and utensils ceased. Bernard froze, his spoon suspended mid-air, his eyes wide with confusion as they locked onto the boy. Marissa's head whipped around, her bright smile vanishing in an instant. Her polished exterior fractured, revealing a flash of something darker, sharper, a dangerous edge lurking just beneath the surface. Her voice was like ice, slicing through the stunned silence. "What did you just say?" Malik's fists were clenched at his sides, his chest heaving as he stood his ground. The weight of every gaze in the cafe pressed down on him, but he didn't falter. His eyes stayed fixed on Bernard, desperation burning in their depths. "Don't eat it," he repeated, his voice steadier this time, though still laced with urgency. "She put something in your soup. I saw her." The cafe erupted into a tense, hushed murmur, the atmosphere electric with shock and disbelief. Malik's heart thundered in his chest as he braced himself for what would come next. There was no turning back now. Malik's chest tightened, a vice-like grip of fear and certainty pressing down on him. This wasn't just a trick of his imagination. He had seen it. Her fingers, the vial, the liquid vanishing into the soup as if it were never there. He didn't know the man sitting at the table, nor did he need to. What mattered was the undeniable truth staring back at him. Something was horribly wrong, and if the old man took even one bite, the consequences would be irreversible. His thoughts spiraled in a frantic loop, but there was no time to deliberate. Right was right and wrong was wrong. Malik didn't need to understand the details to know that he couldn't stand by and let this happen. The moment stretched endlessly, a chasm between what he feared and what he knew he had to do. And then, before his courage could falter, he pushed himself off the railing. His legs felt like they were weighed down by lead, each step a monumental effort, but they carried him forward regardless. Every fiber of his being trembled with fear, yet his determination blazed brighter. He marched straight to the table, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would drown out his voice. But when he opened his mouth, his words came out in a cracked but forceful shout, "Don't eat that!" The cafe fell silent as if someone had turned off a switch. Heads whipped around, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and the sharp clatter of a dropped fork echoed loudly in the stillness. Bernard froze, his spoon suspended just inches from his lips. His wide, startled eyes locked onto Malik, who now stood just feet away, his chest heaving with the effort of speaking up. Across the table, Marissa whipped her head toward the boy, her polished composure splintering in an instant. Her expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, her eyes narrowing as her voice cut through the air like glass. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her tone sharp and brimming with menace. Malik's knees felt weak, but he didn't falter. His voice trembled, his fear palpable, but he made himself heard. "She put something in your food," he said, his words steadying with each syllable. "I saw her." "Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the cafe like a shockwave. Every patron turned toward the scene, their faces a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. The once lively atmosphere had shifted into something suffocating, a tension so thick it was almost tangible. Malik stood his ground, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his chest rising and falling rapidly as adrenaline coursed through his veins. For a moment Bernard didn't move. His gaze flicked from the boy to his wife, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. The spoon in his hand shook slightly and he lowered it back to the table. "What's he talking about, Marissa?" he asked, his voice low but laced with an edge that hinted at unease. Marissa's mask of poise cracked further. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting nervously before she forced a scoff. "Are you seriously listening to him?" she said, her tone icy yet strained. "Look at him, he's just some street kid looking for attention." "He's lying, Bernard." But Malik didn't back down. He stepped closer, his dark eyes fixed on Bernard with unwavering intensity. "I'm not lying," he said firmly, his voice rising slightly. "I saw her. She poured something into your soup and stirred it. If you don't believe me, smell it, test it, Do whatever you need to, but don't eat it. The cafe buzzed with hushed whispers as the weight of the accusation hung heavy in the air. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, their curiosity and shock rippling outward like an unstoppable tide. Bernard's face paled as he studied Malik, his gaze searching for any hint of deceit but finding only the raw honesty of a boy desperate to be believed. "Marissa?" he said again, his tone sharper this time, his piercing gaze turning toward his wife. "What's going on here?" Her facade crumbled further under the pressure of his scrutiny and the murmurs of the crowd. Her expression turned defensive, her voice trembling with barely concealed anger. "This is absurd. You can't seriously think I'd do something like that?" She gestured sharply toward Malik. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Don't let him ruin our day." But Malik's voice cut through her protest like a blade. "I'm telling the truth," he said, his words unwavering despite the tremor in his hands. "You can ignore me if you want, but if you eat that soup, you'll regret it." The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes fixed on Bernard as he weighed the boy's words against his wife's. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with suspicion and unspoken truths. And yet, for all the chaos and uncertainty, one thing was clear: Malik had done his part. Now it was up to Bernard to decide what came next. Bernard blinked, his sharp, calculating gaze shifting back and forth between the boy and his wife. Confusion clouded his features, but beneath it was something darker, a creeping unease that he couldn't ignore. He set the spoon down carefully, his hand trembling ever so slightly, and addressed his wife with a calmness that belied the storm brewing within. "Marissa," he said, his voice steady but questioning, "what is he talking about?" For a split second, Marissa froze, her perfectly composed exterior cracking under the weight of the accusation. Then, like a rubber band snapping under too much tension, her composure shattered. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the stone floor with a jarring screech that seemed to echo through the cafe. Her expression twisted into one of fury, her eyes narrowing as she hissed, "You little liar." Her voice dripped with venom, each word sharper than the last. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile?" she spat, her gaze fixed on Malik like a predator sizing up its prey. "Who even let you in here?" Her polished mask of elegance was gone, replaced by raw anger that seemed almost desperate. The words hit Malik like a blow, but he didn't flinch. His resolve only hardened as he stood his ground, his eyes locking onto Bernard with unflinching determination. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the suffocating tension of being the only one willing to speak the truth. But he couldn't back down now, not when Bernard's life was at stake. "I saw her," Malik said, his voice cracking at first but growing steadier with each word. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." He paused, his chest heaving as he forced himself to continue. "You can smell it if you don't believe me." Bernard's face paled, his already wan complexion growing ashen as he turned back to Marissa. His eyes narrowed, piercing through her like a blade, searching for answers that her words weren't providing. "Marissa," he said again, his voice quieter this time but far more commanding, "what's going on?" Marissa scoffed, her demeanor shifting in an instant. She waved a dismissive hand, the gesture meant to brush away the seriousness of the accusation. "He's just a kid," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "He's trying to cause trouble. Look at him. He probably just wants money or food." Her words were sharp, each one spat out like poison, and her gaze flicked to Malik with open disdain. But the boy didn't flinch, didn't waver. He stood his ground, fists clenched at his sides, his dark eyes burning with the urgency of someone who knew he had no choice but to be believed. The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person who had stopped to watch. Malik felt the gazes of strangers boring into him, but he didn't care. This wasn't about him. It never had been. His focus remained on Bernard, desperate to make him see the truth before it was too late. Bernard's jaw tightened, the lines on his face deepening as his mind raced to piece together what was unfolding before him. His gaze flickered between his wife and the boy, one he had shared his life with, the other a stranger who had nothing to gain from this accusation. Doubt crept into his expression, his calm composure starting to crack under the weight of the boy's unwavering conviction. "Marissa," he said once more, his tone now carrying the weight of authority. "Enough. Tell me the truth." The tension in the cafe was palpable, the hum of whispers and rustling fading into the background as the drama unfolded at the center table. All eyes were on Marissa, whose polished demeanor was now unraveling by the second. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes darting toward the bowl of soup like a trapped animal looking for a way out. I don't have to dignify this ridiculous accusation with a response, she said finally, her voice trembling as she tried to regain control of the narrative. But her words lacked the strength they once held, and even she seemed to realize that the room was no longer hers to command. The once flawless armor of her composure had cracked and the truth, whatever it was beginning to seep through. Malik didn't waver. He stepped closer to the table, his thin frame taut with tension, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His voice, though shaky at first, gained strength as he spoke. I'm not lying, he said firmly, his tone rising above the whispers and murmurs of the cafe. She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything. Bernard's hand hovered over the bowl, his expression a storm of conflicting emotions. Disbelief battled with the gnawing doubt creeping into his mind. The boy's words, spoken with such urgency and conviction, planted seeds of hesitation in his heart. Bernard's fingers twitched, then slowly pulled back from the bowl, leaving it untouched. The air around the table grew thick, a suffocating silence settling over the once lively cafe. Forks rested on plates, coffee cups sat forgotten. Every pair of eyes in the room was fixed on the unfolding scene, their meals now mere afterthoughts. Malik could feel their stares, but his focus remained locked on Bernard, his determination unwavering. Bernard leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied the boy. His scrutinizing gaze bore the marks of a man who had seen countless people try to manipulate him, take advantage of his wealth, his influence. But this was different. The boy didn't flinch, didn't look away. His dark eyes burned with sincerity, a stark contrast to the cold, polished composure of Marissa sitting across the table. Malik, is it? Bernard asked, his voice steady, though a trace of suspicion lingered. Malik nodded quickly, the movement sharp and desperate. Yes, he said, his voice soft but insistent. I'm telling the truth. Please don't eat it. For a moment there was only silence. Then Marissa let out a harsh, brittle laugh, the sound cutting through the tension like a jagged blade. Crossing her arms over her chest, she fixed Malik with a glare so icy it could freeze fire. This is absurd, she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. He's just some street kid looking for attention, or money. Her words came sharp and quick, like arrows aimed to pierce through the boy's resolve. Look at him. Do you really think he has any idea what he's talking about? Her tone was practiced, honed by years of knowing how to command a room. But this time it faltered. The confidence she projected felt hollow, brittle, like a vase teetering on the edge of a shelf. Malik stood his ground, his chest heaving with adrenaline, his fists trembling but still clenched tightly. He refused to back down. I'm not lying, he repeated, louder this time, his voice cutting through Marissa's icy words. I saw her. She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking. His gaze shifted to Bernard, pleading with the older man to listen. You can test it if you don't believe me. Just, don't eat it. Bernard's face remained impassive, but the tension in his jaw betrayed the storm of thoughts raging behind his calm exterior. His gaze flicked from Malik to Marissa, the scrutiny in his eyes intensifying. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the silence pressing down on everyone in the room. Finally, Bernard turned to his wife, his voice low but firm. Marissa, he said, his tone carrying a quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. What's going on? Marissa bristled, her lips pressing into a thin line. Her composure, so meticulously crafted, began to splinter further. I can't believe you're even entertaining this nonsense, she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. He's lying. Why would you even listen to him? But Bernard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he studied her face. The room felt frozen in time, every patron holding their breath as they waited for what would come next. I've seen plenty of liars in my life, Marissa, Bernard said slowly, his voice calm but carrying a razor-sharp edge. His gaze flicked back to Malik. And I've seen fear. This boy, he paused, his words heavy with meaning. He's scared, but he's not lying. Marissa's mask cracked further, her composure slipping inch by inch. Her lips parted, a retort ready on her tongue, but the words didn't come. The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of Bernard's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud about to break. Are you seriously going to entertain this nonsense, Bernard? Marissa's voice rose, sharp and commanding, as she threw her words at him like a lifeline meant to pull him back into her control. Her tone was desperate now, the cracks in her composure widening with each passing second. But Bernard didn't answer. Instead, his gaze lingered on the boy for a moment longer, then shifted to the spoon resting on the table. He picked it up, holding it closer to his face, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear but from the quiet storm building inside him. His brow furrowed deeply and his eyes, sharp and calculating, turned back to Marissa. "Marissa," he said slowly, his voice calm but edged with steel, "you heard him. What exactly is going on here?" His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation and expectation, leaving no room for evasion. Marissa's mask of poise fractured further, her lips pressing into a thin, tight line. For a fleeting moment, panic flashed in her eyes before she replaced it with indignation. "I can't believe you're even asking me that," she snapped, her voice trembling with feigned outrage. "It's insulting, Bernard. Insulting." She turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising as she gestured toward Malik. "He's lying. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" Her words were filled with venom, but instead of cutting through the tension, they seemed to coil around her, strangling her credibility. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, but the reaction she'd hoped for didn't come. Instead, the whispers in the cafe grew louder, spreading like wildfire. Eyes darted between the boy, Marissa, and Bernard, the collective murmur buzzing with doubt and suspicion. "Did she really do it?" one patron whispered. "Look at her," another said, their voice low but audible. "She seems nervous." "That boy doesn't look like he's making this up," came yet another comment. The rising tide of murmurs only stoked Marissa's fury. Her polished demeanor, once so unshakable, shattered completely as she slammed her hands on the table, the force rattling the cutlery. "Enough of this," she hissed, her voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Bernard, eat your damn soup and let's go." Her outburst silenced the whispers for a moment, the sheer force of her anger cutting through the crowd's noise like a whip. But instead of compliance, Bernard's expression darkened, his piercing gaze fixed on her with unrelenting intensity. "Why are you so eager for me to eat this, Marissa?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. The edge in his tone made the hairs on the back of Malik's neck stand on end. Bernard's question wasn't just rhetorical, it was an accusation, sharp and direct, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Marissa opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Her lips quivered as the mask she had so carefully crafted began to crumble before the weight of Bernard's scrutiny and the crowd's judgment. The once polished, poised woman was unraveling, thread by thread, under the unyielding light of truth. The tension in the cafe was suffocating now, every eye trained on the scene unfolding at the center table. Bernard set the spoon down again, his movements deliberate and measured, as though he were controlling the storm within himself by sheer willpower. "Malik," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "what exactly did you see?" The boy stepped closer, his fists still clenched, his breathing steadying as he locked eyes with Bernard. "I saw her pour something into your soup," he said firmly, his voice carrying the strength of truth. "It was a clear liquid from a small vial. She stirred it right after, like she didn't want you to notice." Bernard's face hardened further, his jaw tightening as he turned back to Marissa. "And?" he asked, his voice like a blade. Marissa stumbled over her words, her confidence crumbling into pieces as the whispers around her grew louder again. Her once impeccable facade was now gone, replaced by the desperate flailing of someone backed into a corner. But the more she protested, the less convincing she sounded. And Bernard, ever the sharp observer, was done waiting for answers. "Eat the soup and let's go," Marissa hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. Her hands gripped the edge of the table as if trying to hold onto the last threads of control. But Malik wasn't backing down. He stepped forward again, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he said, his voice rising with urgency that rang through the tense silence. "You're rich, you've got lawyers, doctors, people who can figure this out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." Bernard's jaw tightened, the muscles twitching with the effort to maintain his composure. His spoon was still in his hand, trembling slightly as he stared at the bowl in front of him. He didn't lift it, his mind clearly working through the storm of doubt and suspicion that had now taken root. His tired, calculating eyes shifted from the boy to his wife, narrowing as they landed on her. "Marissa," he said, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of calm that comes before an explosion, "you've been acting strange for weeks now. And now this." Marissa's face flushed a deep red, her confidence faltering under the weight of his words. She stumbled, her usual polished demeanor crumbling like brittle glass. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice wavering. "You can't seriously think I'd poison me?" Bernard finished for her, his tone razor-sharp. The finality of his words cut through the room like a blade, leaving an audible gasp rippling through the gathered crowd. The cafe was alive with murmurs now, the whispers growing louder as patrons leaned in, their curiosity overtaking their discretion. Malik stood firm, his feet planted as though rooted to the ground. His heart pounded so fiercely he thought it might burst, but his gaze remained unwavering, locked on Bernard. He had done all he could. The truth was out now, exposed for everyone to see. It wasn't his choice anymore, it was Bernard's. Bernard's piercing eyes bore into Marissa, the weight of his scrutiny forcing her to straighten up. Her expression, however, didn't crumble further. Instead, it hardened into something cold and unrecognizable. Her lips pressed into a thin, defiant line, and her eyes narrowed, glinting with an edge of fury. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice regaining some of its venom. "You're seriously listening to a street kid over your own wife? He doesn't know anything. He's just trying to ruin us." But her words didn't have the same power as before. The crowd had seen her mask slip, her desperation bare for all to witness. The murmurs grew louder, whispers of doubt and disbelief spreading through the room like wildfire. "Then why not prove him wrong?" Bernard asked, his voice deceptively calm but laced with accusation. "If he's lying, why not let someone test the soup?" Marissa froze, her body stiffening as though struck. For a fleeting moment, her lips parted as if to answer, but nothing came out. The silence was damning, more powerful than any admission she could have made. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air heavy with anticipation. Malik felt the weight of every gaze in the cafe pressing down on him, but he refused to let his knees buckle under it. He had no power here, no status, no wealth, but he had the truth. And that was enough. Bernard's hand released the spoon, letting it clatter against the bowl as he pushed it away. His expression was one of utter exhaustion, a man betrayed not just by his wife but by his own ability to trust. He stood slowly, his towering presence commanding silence from the onlookers. His gaze never left Marissa as he spoke, his voice steady but chilling. "You've always been a good liar, Marissa," he said, his tone cutting through the room like ice. "But not today." The words landed like a blow and Marissa flinched as if struck. Her confidence, once unshakable, was now in tatters, exposed for what it was, a fragile facade. The cafe was utterly still, the crowd's whispers dying down as they waited to see what would happen next. "Waiter," Bernard called, his voice firm and commanding. "Get someone to test this." His eyes flicked back to Marissa, his expression unreadable. "Let's see who's really lying here." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the charged tension breaking into a flurry of murmurs and hurried movements. Marissa's face turned ghostly pale, her defiance fading as the inevitability of the truth bore down on her. Malik watched it all, his breath finally releasing in a trembling exhale. He had done what he came to do, and now the rest was out of his hands. "This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense," Marissa snapped, her voice shrill with indignation. She snatched her handbag and made a move to leave, her heels clicking against the floor with a sharp finality. But before she could take a step, Bernard's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and firm, laced with a finality that froze her in place. His sharp eyes bore into hers, leaving no room for argument. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." The cafe seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The waiter, who had been standing frozen like a statue, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I call the police?" he asked hesitantly, his gaze darting between Bernard and Marissa. The question rippled through the cafe like a shockwave. Patrons gasped, whispers erupted, and for the first time, Marissa looked genuinely panicked. Her carefully constructed composure cracked wide open, her face pale as she shook her head violently. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her voice trembling as she glared at the waiter. "This is just a misunderstanding. Bernard, you can't seriously." But Bernard raised his hand, silencing her mid-sentence with a gesture so commanding that the entire cafe seemed to quiet. "Yes," he said, addressing the waiter without even glancing away from Marissa. "Call them." The words landed like a thunderclap, sending another ripple through the room. Malik, standing just a few feet away, felt a fleeting surge of relief. For the first time since he'd spoken up, it felt like someone was finally taking him seriously. But the relief was brief. The truth still wasn't out and the tension was far from over. The waiter nodded, his face pale but determined, and hurried inside to make the call. The silence that followed was deafening, the hum of the cafe replaced by an unbearable stillness. Bernard released Marissa's wrist, his hand falling away slowly, but his eyes never left hers. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a cold, steely resolve. Marissa stood rooted to the spot, her polished charm now completely unraveling. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag like a lifeline. The confidence she had wielded so effortlessly was gone, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. She looked cornered, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. The cafe patrons watched in stunned silence, their gazes flicking between Bernard, Marissa, and Malik. The weight of the unfolding drama hung heavy in the air, each moment stretching into an eternity. Malik stood quietly, his fists still clenched at his sides, his heart pounding as he waited to see what would happen next. Bernard's voice broke the silence, calm but razor-sharp. "You've been acting strange for weeks," he said, his words deliberate and precise. "Now I know why." Marissa flinched as though he had struck her. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her composure shattering with every second that passed. The murmurs from the onlookers grew louder again, whispers swirling through the cafe like a rising storm. "Is it true?" someone muttered, their voice barely audible but carrying through the tense air. "I can't believe it," another whispered. "She's guilty, isn't she?" The growing noise seemed to make Marissa more frantic. Her breathing quickened, and her hands shook even harder as she tried to reassemble her shattered facade. But the weight of Bernard's unwavering gaze, combined with the collective judgment of the crowd, was too much to bear. The faint sound of sirens in the distance sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Her composure broke completely, her voice rising in a desperate attempt to regain control. "Bernard, please," she pleaded, her tone now trembling with fear. "You can't let them. You don't understand." But Bernard didn't blink. "No," he said firmly, his voice as cold and unyielding as steel. "I understand perfectly." The cafe erupted into hushed murmurs once more as the sound of the sirens grew louder, the inevitable drawing closer with every second. Marissa's once dominant presence had dissolved into pure desperation, her carefully built walls crumbling in full view of everyone. And Malik, standing silently at the edge of the chaos, felt the weight of his actions settle on him like a heavy blanket. He had done what he could. The truth was finally coming, and the rest was out of his hands. Marissa's eyes darted around the cafe, her lips moving silently as though searching for an escape route that wasn't there. Desperation clung to her like a second skin, her once commanding presence reduced to fragments. Her polished facade had crumbled, leaving behind a woman visibly unraveling. Meanwhile, Malik stood just a few steps back, his body tense and trembling. His hands shook slightly, the adrenaline that had driven him forward now giving way to doubt. Had he done enough? What if Bernard didn't believe him after all? Worse, what if Marissa managed to twist the situation, her charm and cunning convincing everyone that he was nothing more than a liar, a desperate kid trying to stir up trouble? He clenched his fists tightly, his nails digging into his palms as he forced himself to stay rooted in place. He couldn't falter now. Not when the truth was so close to coming out. "Malik," Bernard said suddenly, his deep, steady voice slicing through the suffocating tension like a blade. The unexpected sound made Malik flinch slightly, but he quickly looked up, meeting Bernard's sharp, calculating gaze. "You said you saw her put something in the soup," Bernard continued, his tone firm but calm. "Can you describe it?" Malik nodded quickly, taking a step forward. His voice was steady, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him heavily. "It was a small bottle," he said, each word clear and deliberate. "Like the kind you'd use for medicine. It had clear liquid inside. She poured it in while you were looking at your phone, then stirred it so you wouldn't notice. I swear I saw it." Bernard's expression hardened, the lines on his face deepening as he processed the boy's words. His jaw tightened, the muscles flexing as his eyes turned toward Marissa. She was already shaking her head, her panic growing more visible by the second. "This is absurd." Marissa snapped, her voice rising with anger, though it trembled at the edges. "He's lying. Why would I?" But Bernard cut her off, his voice sharp and unyielding. "Why would he lie?" he demanded, leaning forward slightly as his piercing gaze bore into her. What could he possibly gain from this? His question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The crowd began to murmur again, their whispers blending into a rising tide of doubt and curiosity. Marissa's eyes darted toward the bowl of soup in front of Bernard, her panic escalating with each passing second. In that brief, flickering moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped completely. Her face betrayed something raw and unguarded, an unmistakable flash of guilt. She caught herself quickly, but the damage was done. The moment had been brief, but it was enough. The faint wail of approaching sirens grew louder, the sound slicing through the thick tension in the room. The charged atmosphere in the cafe reached a fever pitch, every patron holding their breath as they awaited what would happen next. Bernard leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers drumming against the table as he studied Marissa with an intensity that made her squirm. "Answer me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding growl. Why would he lie? Marissa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her lips quivered as she glanced around desperately, her gaze flitting between Bernard, Malik, and the now attentive crowd. The sirens were close now, their sound echoing in the quiet cafe like an omen. Malik stood silently, his hands still clenched but his resolve unbroken. He had spoken his truth. Now all he could do was wait. Bernard's unwavering gaze remained fixed on Marissa, the weight of his scrutiny pinning her in place like a spotlight on a guilty performer caught mid-act. The truth was no longer something that could be avoided. It was closing in, relentless and inevitable, like the sound of the sirens that now blared just outside the cafe doors. And everyone in the room knew that once it arrived, there would be no escape. Marissa's carefully crafted facade shattered completely, the cracks now gaping wide for all to see. She looked cornered, like an animal backed into a cage, her polished poise replaced by sheer desperation. As if grasping at straws, she rounded on Malik, her voice sharp and cutting. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something?" The accusation hit Malik like a slap, but he didn't flinch. His fists tightened at his sides, his breathing steady despite the sharp sting of her words. He met her venomous gaze head-on, refusing to waver. "I'm not jealous," he said firmly, his voice clear and unwavering. "I saw what I saw and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." His words rang with conviction, cutting through the tension like a knife. The sirens outside grew louder, their wailing now unmistakably close. Moments later, 2 police officers entered the cafe, their presence immediately commanding the room. The atmosphere shifted, the charged energy in the air tightening as the officers approached the table. The room seemed to shrink, the focus narrowing to the unfolding drama at the center of it all. One of the officers, a tall man with a steady gaze, spoke first. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone neutral but carrying the weight of authority. Bernard, ever the commanding figure, stood slowly, his towering frame still radiating respect and control despite the strain of the situation. "Officers," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to take a look at this." He gestured toward the bowl of soup sitting untouched on the table. "This boy claims my wife poisoned it." The officers exchanged quick glances, their expressions carefully blank as they approached the table. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, while the other turned his attention to Marissa. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice steady, "do you have anything to say about this?" Marissa's face flushed crimson, her composure unraveling further with each second. She scoffed, her tone defensive and dismissive. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "He's just a street kid trying to make trouble. You can't seriously believe anything he says." Her voice, once commanding and persuasive, now carried a frantic edge that did little to help her case. The cafe patrons, still gathered and watching intently, exchanged knowing glances, their whispers growing louder as doubt crept into their minds. The officer studying the soup straightened up, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to test this," he said, his tone professional but firm. At the mention of testing, Marissa's eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of panic she couldn't completely mask. Her hands trembled as she clutched her handbag tightly, her knuckles whitening under the strain. "That won't be necessary," she said quickly, her voice strained as she glanced at Bernard. "Bernard, you can't let this go on. This is humiliating. You know me, you know I'd never do something like this." But Bernard's gaze didn't soften. His expression was carved from stone, his eyes locked on her with unrelenting scrutiny. "Then you have nothing to worry about, Marissa," he said, his tone cold and deliberate. "Let them test it." The officer gestured toward the bowl, preparing to take it into evidence. The sound of his gloves snapping into place sent a ripple of tension through the room. Marissa's breathing quickened, her face growing paler as the inevitability of the situation pressed down on her. Malik stood silently, his chest heaving slightly as he watched the scene unfold. He had done all he could. The truth was no longer in his hands, but he felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. Marissa's voice broke through the silence, sharp and trembling. "This is insane." "He's lying," she shouted, her words desperate but hollow. Why would I ever do something like this? But her protests only seemed to cement the doubt in the air. The once polished veneer of her confidence was now shattered, leaving behind raw desperation that no one in the room could ignore. The cafe was silent again, save for the quiet murmurs of the officers as they prepared to take the soup for testing. Bernard's voice, low and steady, cut through the stillness. "Marissa," he said, his tone carrying a gravity that silenced even the whispers in the room, "if you're innocent, then let them prove it." Her lips trembled, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an ally, but there were none. For the first time she looked truly cornered. "He's just a kid trying to make trouble?" Marissa's voice cracked with desperation, her tone climbing higher as she glared at Bernard. "Are you really going to let this nonsense go this far?" But the officer standing nearby wasn't buying it. "We need to test the contents," he said firmly, reaching for the bowl of soup. "No?" Marissa snapped, her voice suddenly rising in a sharp outburst that sliced through the tension in the cafe. Her tone, filled with raw panic, drew even more attention from the gathered crowd. Heads turned, murmurs swelled, and her sudden vehemence only deepened the doubt etched on every face. The officer froze, narrowing his eyes as he studied her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but piercing, "is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" Marissa hesitated, her composure crumbling visibly as her chest rose and fell in rapid breaths. Her eyes darted to Bernard, then to the officers, her polished mask now entirely gone. Her hands trembled as they gripped her handbag, her knuckles white from the pressure. Finally, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the moment had finally broken her. "Fine," she spat, her voice low but dripping with venom. "You want the truth?" The cafe fell deathly silent, every patron holding their breath as Marissa's eyes burned with a mix of fury and resignation. "I'm tired of living in his shadow," she said, her words slicing through the air like a dagger. "Tired of his control over everything. He was never supposed to make it past this year and I—" She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening in horror as the realization of what she had just confessed sank in. But it was too late. Her words hung in the air, heavy and damning, leaving no room for misinterpretation. The cafe erupted in gasps, the sound sharp and collective, like the crash of a breaking wave. Some patrons immediately pulled out their phones, their screens lighting up as they recorded the unfolding scene. Bernard's face went pale, his expression one of stunned disbelief. Her confession hit him like a freight train, the full weight of her betrayal crashing down on him. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the table, his sharp features hardening into a mask of cold fury. The officer stepped forward, his voice now firm and authoritative. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us," he said, his hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. Marissa's defiance wavered for a brief moment, her lips parting as though she might protest. But the energy seemed to drain from her, and her shoulders slumped in defeat. The reality of her situation was inescapable. The truth was out and there was no going back. The cafe patrons watched in a mixture of shock and fascination, their hushed whispers filling the air as the officers moved to detain her. Bernard didn't move, his gaze locked on Marissa as if trying to reconcile the woman he had known with the person standing before him now. The betrayal, so raw and complete, left an ache that seemed to hollow him out. As the officers reached for Marissa, Malik stood quietly to the side, his fists unclenching for the first time in what felt like hours. He had done what he could, and now the weight of the truth rested on someone else's shoulders. The officer's expression turned grim, his voice steady and authoritative as he stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them." Marissa's composure shattered like glass. She let out a piercing scream, her voice filled with desperation as she struggled against the officers. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice cracking as she tried to wriggle free while they secured her hands behind her back. "I deserved everything he had, everything." The words, dripping with bitterness and rage, echoed through the cafe, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. All eyes were on her as the officers led her away, her protests fading into the background, swallowed by the gravity of the moment. The room seemed frozen in time, the air thick with disbelief. At the center of it all, Bernard sank back into his chair, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of what he had just witnessed. His hand trembled as he pushed the bowl of soup away, the untouched meal now a symbol of something far darker. For a long moment he said nothing, his face a mask of disbelief and betrayal, etched with the pain of Marissa's confession. The murmurs in the cafe began to rise again, soft at first, then growing louder as patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, processing the shocking events. Some looked at Bernard with pity, their gazes filled with sympathy for a man so deeply betrayed. Others watched him with curiosity, unable to look away from the scene that had unfolded. Malik stood frozen a few steps away, unsure of what to do next. His hands hung at his sides, trembling slightly as the adrenaline that had fueled him drained away, leaving him feeling small and out of place in the now quiet cafe. He had done what he could, he had spoken the truth. But what now? Then Bernard's eyes found him, cutting through the haze of the moment. At first, his gaze was unreadable, heavy with exhaustion and disbelief. But slowly as his expression softened, a flicker of something else emerged: gratitude. For the first time since the chaos began, Bernard seemed to see Malik fully. Not as a ragged boy from the streets, but as someone who had stepped forward when no one else had. Someone who had risked everything to save him. "Malik," Bernard said softly, his voice hoarse but steady. The boy flinched slightly, unsure if he should speak or stay silent. But Bernard offered a faint, weary nod, his lips twitching into the barest hint of a smile. "You saved my life," he said simply, his words heavy with sincerity. Malik's throat tightened and he struggled to find his voice. I couldn't let her hurt you," he stammered, his words tumbling out awkwardly. The cafe began to settle back into its rhythm, the sharp tension of moments earlier easing into a low hum of whispers and murmurs. As the officers escorted Marissa out, her shouts and protests faded into the distance, leaving behind an air of stunned quiet. The patrons turned their attention back to their tables, though the weight of what they had witnessed lingered in their expressions. Bernard gestured for Malik to sit, his tired eyes softening further. "You didn't have to do what you did," he said, his voice low but filled with meaning. "But you did. And I'll never forget it." For the first time, Malik allowed himself to breathe. The tension in his chest eased just slightly as he sank into the chair Bernard had indicated. In that moment, surrounded by the fading echoes of betrayal and truth, the boy who had been invisible to the world was finally seen. Malik didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his body tense and his mind racing, unsure if he was supposed to stay or quietly slip away. The weight of what had just unfolded felt overwhelming, and he didn't know if he belonged in this world of polished floors and affluent stairs. Bernard turned to him, his face still pale and drawn from the ordeal, but his eyes now steady and focused. "Malik," he said softly, his voice cutting through the lingering hum of whispers. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit." Malik hesitated, his gaze flickering to the onlookers who were still watching with wide-eyed curiosity. Every instinct told him to leave, to escape before someone decided he didn't belong there. But there was something in Bernard's tone, an authority mixed with sincerity, that made him pause. Slowly he obeyed, sinking into the chair with his shoulders still hunched, his entire body tense as though ready to bolt at any moment. Bernard studied him for a moment, his expression softening. "You saved my life," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Malik fidgeted, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to ground himself. I couldn't let it happen," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He looked down, avoiding Bernard's gaze. "I couldn't just watch and say nothing." Bernard nodded slowly, his gaze distant as if he were replaying the entire ordeal in his mind. "Most people would have," he said after a long pause. His tone was calm, reflective. "Most would have turned the other way, pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. That took courage, boy." Malik shrugged, his voice small but steady. I don't like seeing people get hurt, that's all." He glanced up briefly, his dark eyes meeting Bernard's before quickly darting away again. Bernard leaned back in his chair, studying Malik intently for the first time. It was as though he were truly seeing him, not just as a scrappy street kid who had interrupted his lunch, but as someone far more significant. The boy's quiet bravery, his unwavering determination, spoke volumes in a way that words never could. For a moment, Bernard said nothing, his piercing gaze softened by something unspoken, a mix of gratitude, respect, and perhaps even guilt. He could feel the enormity of what had just been revealed, not only about Marissa but about himself and the world he lived in. "You remind me," Bernard began slowly, his voice carrying the weight of years, "that courage doesn't always come from where you expect. Sometimes, it shows up in the places you least imagine." Malik didn't respond, but his posture relaxed just slightly, his grip on the table loosening. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the warmth of Bernard's words, a kind of recognition he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember. In that moment, surrounded by the murmurs of a cafe that was slowly returning to life, the two of them shared an unspoken understanding. Malik, who had always been invisible to the world, had stepped forward and been seen. And Bernard, who had spent his life building walls to protect himself from others, had let those walls come down, if only for a moment. Bernard looked at Malik, his gaze piercing but not unkind, studying him in a way that went beyond appearances. He didn't just see a scrappy kid from the streets anymore. He saw someone with a story, someone who had risked everything to do what was right. Malik shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze, unsure of what to say. "How long have you been out here?" Bernard asked, his tone gentle but direct. The question caught Malik off guard. He looked away, his voice tinged with embarrassment. "A while," he murmured, his fingers fidgeting with the frayed hem of his hoodie. Bernard frowned, the lines on his face deepening with concern. But he didn't press further. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black phone. "Wait here," he said, standing and stepping aside to make a call. Malik's heart pounded with anxiety as he watched Bernard move a few steps away. Was he in trouble now? The thought made his stomach churn. What if Bernard was calling someone to have him removed, to report him for trespassing or causing a scene? Malik clenched his fists tightly, his instincts screaming at him to run. But something, perhaps the glimmer of kindness he had seen in Bernard's eyes, kept him rooted to the spot. When Bernard returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. "Help is on the way," he said simply, his voice steady and reassuring. "Help?" Malik repeated, his brow furrowing in confusion. Bernard nodded. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight, somewhere safe." He paused, his gaze softening further. "And if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." Malik's eyes widened, the words hitting him like a wave. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly, his voice defensive and uncertain. "I didn't do this for money or anything." Bernard smiled faintly, the corners of his lips curling into an expression that was both tired and warm. "I know," he said, his tone carrying the weight of unspoken gratitude. "That's why I want to help you. You did something most people wouldn't have done." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "And trust me, Malik, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." Malik stared at Bernard, the words sinking into him slowly. For a boy who had spent so much of his life unseen, unnoticed, and uncared for, the offer felt almost too much to believe. His shoulders tensed as he fought the instinct to reject the kindness, to tell Bernard it wasn't necessary. But something about Bernard's sincerity made it impossible to dismiss. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. It wasn't just the promise of a safe place to sleep or a helping hand, it was the feeling of being seen, truly seen for the first time. For the first time in a long while, Malik felt a warmth he couldn't quite describe. It started as a small flicker in his chest, growing with each word Bernard had spoken. His gaze dropped to the table, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like that, like he mattered, like his actions could make a difference. Around them, the cafe patrons began to disperse, their murmurs softening as the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. Some glanced back at Bernard and Malik with expressions of curiosity or quiet reflection, their conversations subdued, as though the events had left an indelible mark on them too. Bernard, sitting tall but visibly drained, picked up his glass of water and took a slow sip. He set it down deliberately, his movements thoughtful, before breaking the silence. "Sometimes life gives us the chance to change someone else's story," he said, his voice low but resonant. "You changed mine today, Malik. And maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." Malik glanced up at him, his dark eyes wide and glistening with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. It was fragile, delicate, like the first rays of sunlight breaking through a storm. But it was there, unmistakable and real. The two sat in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them like a quiet embrace. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky, casting long golden shadows that stretched across the cafe's tiled floor. The day had shifted, the ordinary turned extraordinary, and the lessons of courage and kindness hung in the air like an unspoken truth. The patrons who had witnessed the event carried its impact with them as they left, the drama of the afternoon etched in their minds. It wasn't just the shock of Marissa's betrayal or Bernard's near miss with tragedy, it was the quiet bravery of a boy who had stepped forward when no one else would. A boy who had risked everything to stand up for what was right. Malik's bravery hadn't just saved a life, it had left an indelible mark on everyone in that cafe. It reminded them that courage doesn't always wear a suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy or powerful. Sometimes, It's the people we overlook, the ones standing on the edges of our lives, who have the greatest strength of all. As the shadows lengthened and the cafe returned to a semblance of normalcy, Bernard and Malik remained seated, two strangers brought together by a moment that had changed them both. In the end, it wasn't just Malik who had been reminded of the power of doing what's right, it was everyone who had been there to witness it. And in that quiet corner of the cafe, hope burned a little brighter, for both a boy who had finally been seen and a man who had been given a second chance to see the world anew. Standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, takes courage. Malik's story is a powerful reminder that even the smallest voices can make the biggest difference. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even small actions, fueled by kindness and bravery, can create life-changing impacts. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together we can keep the flame of hope alive. The story at Bluebird Cafe is not just a dramatic clash between truth and deceit, but also a deeply emotional tale of courage and kindness. Tyler, a homeless boy who had lived in the shadows of society, unexpectedly became the light that exposed a frightening truth. Despite not knowing Jonathan, he overcame fear, prejudice, and the divide between their worlds to stand up and prevent a tragedy. Tyler's bravery not only saved Jonathan's life but also shattered the veil of deception that Rebecca tried to maintain. Jonathan, from his position of immense power and wealth, was reminded of the value of kindness and trust. In the moment his eyes met Tyler's, he saw not just a street kid but a person with a strong heart and unyielding spirit. His emotions shifted from the pain of Rebecca's betrayal to respect and gratitude for the boy who changed his story. The story delivers a profound message. Courage doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes, it lies within the smallest among us, those whom society often overlooks. Through his actions, Tyler not only transformed Jonathan's life but also touched the hearts of everyone who witnessed the event, reminding them that kindness and courage can come from the most unexpected places. This is what makes the story so memorable. Not just its drama but the powerful emotions it evokes. Hope, redemption, and the transformative power of compassion in changing lives. And now, it leaves us with a question to ponder. In your life, have you ever dared to stand up for the truth and what's right, even when no one else saw or supported you? Ask yourself, what would you do if given the chance to change someone's story, even with a small act of courage? The story of Tyler and Jonathan doesn't just end with what happened in the cafe. It leaves us with a profound question to reflect upon. In your life, have you ever dared to stand up for the truth and what's right, even when no one else saw or supported you? Ask yourself, what would you do if given the chance to change someone's story, even with a small act of courage? Kindness and courage are essential and ever-present within each individual. Only through courage can the world regain its inherent peace and happiness. Moreover, true love is about granting someone freedom, not controlling them through money or power, as such control distorts both love and happiness. Soul Deep Stories hopes to bring you inspiring messages about life every day. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and stay tuned for daily content.